Hello students, today we are going to discuss electoral politics and the changing nature of caste. This unit would enable the students to understand democratic politics and its bearing on caste, democratic politics and the changing nature of caste, role of caste in electoral politics. In the context of society today, the caste system and much of whatever comes with it are wholly incompatible, reactionary, restrictive and barriers to progress. There can be no equality in status and opportunity within its framework, nor can there be political democracy. Between these two conceptions, conflict is inherent and only one of them can survive. This was reiterated by Jawaharlal Nehru. The ideals enshrined in the preamble to the Indian Constitution reflected a vision of liberal democracy that would ensure a dignified existence to each and every individual and endow them with certain fundamental rights vis-a-vis the state and fellow citizens. The directive principles of the state policy, Article 38 of the Constitution, clarified it further by making it explicit that the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic and political shall inform all the institutions of national life. Any form of discrimination on grounds of sex, religion, race, caste and gender or place of birth will be prohibited. Following the practice in democratic regions around the world, the Indian Constitution invested all legislative power in certain institutions of government to be made up by electoral representatives of the people. These representatives were to be chosen strictly in accordance with the principle of universal adult franchise. The independent state of India went a step ahead and instituted certain legal and institutional measures as protection, albeit temporarily, to enable groups and communities of people who had been historically disadvantaged because of certain social practices to participate in the game of democratic politics in equal terms. The political elites of the time, those who inherited power from the British Raj in 1947, were perhaps all unanimous on the question of caste. They all agreed that caste can have no legitimate place in the democratic setup. However, over the last more than 7 decades of India's independence, governance in India, caste has not only survived in Indian politics, but has also in fact flourished. India is the largest democracy in the world. In a democratic system, each adult citizen uses voting as an expression of his approval or disapproval of government decisions, the various policies and programs of political parties, and the qualities of the candidates who are engaged in the struggle to get their status as the representative of the people. Politics, however, is not about elections alone. It could have different manifestations, and the nature of these manifestations may also vary when we move from one region to another. For example, from a macro-regional context to a micro or local regional context. Participation in democratic politics has a direct bearing on the working of caste relations in the society. Similarly, the prevailing structures of caste relation and the changes taking place herein play an important role in enabling or disabling different caste groups in their effort to participate in the politics at different level. This is particularly the case with the Dalits, the ex-untouchables. In other words, the question of caste and democracy must also be seen by looking simultaneously at what is happening at the caste system on ground, namely in terms of the changing structures of social and economic relations. This would also help us to answer the question as to what empowers a particular caste to mobilize itself and participate in the democratic politics. The changing realities of caste in the context of contemporary India and its interaction with the social and political structures has a far-reaching impact on the democratic politics. Even though the impact of liberal democracy and evolutionist notion of the social change and the inevitability of Western style of modernization is obvious in modern Indian society, many scholars recognized that the tremendous resilience of caste as an institution in the face of modernization. Quite clearly, they had reported on the likely impact of caste on the working of democratic institutions and the implications of a new form of politics for the system of caste hierarchy. For instance, instead of completely replacing traditional ascriptive structures of caste society by an open system of social stratification based on individual choices and achievements, new modes of democratic governance and growing use of modern technology has in some ways strengthened caste. Caste and democratic politics signify opposite value system. Caste is hierarchical, in which the status of an individual in the social system is determined by birth. On the other hand, democratic political system supports freedom of an individual and equality of status with an emphasis that no one is above the rule of law. Following the introduction of democratic institutions as per the Indian Constitution, Indian society has changed to a considerable extent. Rajni Kothari in Caste in Indian Politics argues that in India, politicization of caste has taken place. Caste and politics entered a relationship which has changed the both. Consequently, secularization of caste has taken place. Secularization of caste denotes that the caste system and their role is not confined to the traditional role defined by priority of purity and pollution. It helps in mobilization of caste for secular interest such as power and employment. Secularization of caste has helped in the formation of inter-caste alliances and coalitions as well. Commenting on the nature of change experienced in caste with the rise of non-Brahmanic movement in southern provinces, Ghurye has argued as early as in 1932 that attack on hierarchy by such mobilization did not necessarily mean the end of caste system. These mobilization generate a new kind of collective sentiment, the feeling of caste solidarity, which could be truly described as caste patriotism. Srinivasan developed this point further in his writing during the late 1950s, focusing specifically on the possible consequences of modern technology and representational politics, both of which were introduced by the Britishers in India. He argued that far from disappearing with the process of modernization, caste was experiencing a horizontal consolidation. Commenting on the impact of modern technology on caste, Srinivasan wrote, "The coming in of printing, of a regular postal service, of vernacular newspapers and books, of the telegraph, railways and bus enabled the representatives of caste living in different areas to meet and discuss their common problems and interests. Western education gave new political values such as liberty and equality. The educated leaders started caste journals and held caste conferences. Funds were collected to organize the caste and to help the poorer members. Caste hostels, hospitals, cooperative societies, etc., became a common feature of the urban social life. In general, it may be confidently said that the last 100 years have seen a great increase in caste solidarity and the concomitant decrease of a sense of interdependence between different castes living in a region. Representational politics by the British helped in the horizontal consolidation of caste in many ways. According to Srinivas, the policy which the British adopted of giving a certain amount of power to local self-governing bodies and preferences and concessions to backward caste provided new opportunities to caste. In order to be able to take advantage of these opportunities, caste groups, as traditionally understood, entered into alliances with each other to form bigger alliances. With the introduction of democratic politics in independent India, the horizontal solidarity of caste, which also meant a kind of competition among different castes at the economic political sphere, eventually weakened the vertical solidarity of the caste. Therefore, the caste system too was undergoing a change. The nationalist leadership at the time of India's independence from the colonial ruler were over enthusiastic about the project of modernity and change. The belief that all relations active in Indian society could be erased and entirely new ones written down through a heroic comprehensive legislative act had its origin in the prevalent functionalist and evolutionary notion of democracy. As has been convincingly argued by social scientists over the last 3 decades, even the idea of tradition and modernity are of little value when presented as dichotomous categories. They tend to dehistoricize the experience of change. Caste, in such perspective, appeared as a peculiar Indian, never-changing reality that characterized the very basis of India's social structure. Now we come to democratic politics and the changing nature of caste. Sudipta Kaviraj has argued about the plasticity of tradition and the fact that caste group, instead of crumbling with historical embarrassment, in fact adapted themselves surprisingly well to the demands of parliamentary politics. Their participation in electoral politics also transformed the structural properties of caste in one fundamental respect. It created a democracy of caste in place of a hierarchy of caste. In the competitive electoral politics, what mattered for a political party was the number of votes a given caste group had and the extent of its partial concentration. Thus, in the Indian case, the democratic equality and the experiences of participating in electoral politics has mainly been translated as equality between caste groups, not among casteless individuals. Caste is assuming new role in the context of democratic politics. They are setting up their organization known as caste associations. They raise social, economic and political issues of different caste groups. Caste associations make representation to the government demanding educational facilities, land ownership and its distribution, government jobs, etc. for their caste members. They raise issues concerning their caste by submitting memoranda to governments, organize public meetings, etc. Caste articulate their interest by forming caste organizations. There are two kinds of organizations, caste associations and caste federations. In order to pursue their interest, claims for representation to the governmental demanding educational facilities, land ownership, its distribution, all these features and social mobility, caste have established their organizations for this purpose. Origin of caste organization can be traced to pre-independent India. In the initial stages, caste organization largely concentrated themselves with the idea of giving representation and voice to the marginalized. However, with the entrenchment of liberal democracy and extension of adult franchise, their aim began to change with the rise in the demand for their representation in the administration, educational and political spheres. In this context, Rudolph and Rudolph summarized the role of caste association in politics. Caste associations attempted to have their own members nominated for elective office, working through existing parties or forming their own to maximize caste representation and influence in state cabinets and lesser governing bodies, and to use ministerial, legislative and administrative channels to press for action on caste objectives in the welfare, educational and economic realm. Perhaps the most significant aspect of caste association in the contemporary era, however, is its capacity to organize politically illiterate mass, thus making possible in some measure the realization of its aspiration and educating large section of it in the methods and values of political democracy. This strategy strengthened their bargaining position in the political system in terms of power and representation. Change in the nature of caste has taken place because of interaction between caste and political institutions. Rajni Kothari emphasized three aspects while discussing about the interaction between caste and politics. The first aspect can be seen in the form of secularization of caste through their political involvement. This will alter the traditionally maintained rigid features and lead to the breakup of the old social order. This enables to process of alignment and realignment of various strata and gradually embracing the process of social mobility. The second aspect is related to the integration dimension. The caste system not only differentiates individuals on the basis of their caste identity, but also distinguishes on the basis of occupational and economic roles. At the same time, it is an integral structure of specific type, namely one that is more intense in its small group orientation and particularistic loyalties, and where wider loyalties operate only when they are structured through the prevailing differentiations. This aspect is important in understanding the structural impact of democratic nation building. The third aspect is related to consciousness. That is, caste enters politics through consciousness and then it gets politicized. The practice of adult franchise in association with the provisions of political reservation for the Dalits has further strengthened consciousness among the concentrated communities. Therefore, three consequences of such interaction between caste and politics can be deduced. Firstly, caste members, particularly poor and marginalized, who previously remained untouched by the political process, got politicized and began to participate in electoral politics with an expectation that their interest will be served. Secondly, caste members get split among various political parties, weakening the hold of the caste. Thirdly, numerically large caste gets represented in decision-making bodies and strength and the traditionally dominant caste gets weakened. The interaction between caste and democratic politics has resulted in, firstly, increased political participation of various castes. Secondly, it also divided a caste support among various political parties, and the rigidity of the caste system gets weakened. And thirdly, numerically large caste, Dalits and the OBCs, gets more representation in decision making bodies than the higher caste. This weakened the dominance of the latter in politics and made it more inclusive. Now we come to the role of caste in electoral politics. Caste is one of the most important determinants of Indian politics. The increasing consciousness of caste affiliations and the rise of caste-based organization has transformed the contours of Indian politics. With the introduction of universal adult franchise in India for all social groups, including the previously excluded ones, caste emerged as one of the most significant forces of political mobilization. Preponderance of caste in electoral politics consists of two aspects. Firstly, caste profiles of the elected representative or consideration of caste in distribution of tickets by the parties to contest elections and leaders of political parties, and second, the support base of caste to political parties. The first dimension shows the inclusion of caste in the parties and legislative bodies. The second dimension is indicative of the role of caste in determining the electoral success. The second aspect can also explain the relative weight of caste and other issues such as employment, health, education, governance, etc. in electoral politics. In view of these aspects, caste has been a major factor determining political strategies to mobilize support of various castes. Although all kinds of factors influence voters' decisions to support particular political parties, caste also is one of them. Indeed, some caste or caste groups form support base for some parties. For example, the Dalits form a substantial support base for the BSP. Till the 1980s, the Congress Party's support base in the North India largely consisted of the Dalits, backward classes and high caste. Paul Brass termed it as coalition of caste. Following these strategies, different caste or rather different political parties take into consideration the caste composition of a constituency and make assessment as to which caste candidate should be allotted ticket to contest election. Even the voters quite often take into consideration the caste of the candidate while voting. Several studies has underlined the role of caste in empowering the people, especially those from the marginalized section of the society. Some examples of these studies include Jeffrelot and Kumar's the book The Rise of the Plebeians, The Changing Face of Indian Legislative Assemblies, shows that in the post-independence period, the social profiles of several legislative assemblies in India have seen the increase in the number of persons from plebeians or marginalized caste groups such as the Dalits and the OBCs. In his book Who Wants Democracy, Javed Alam suggests that the low caste find caste as an empowering tool. Caste is one of the most important aspects of social and political life in India. As a social institution, it is strongly entrenched, and despite the modernization trends in India, the caste factors persist. Although caste has undergone many changes, it has become a factor to be reckoned with in politics, and no political party ignores it. With this, we have come to the conclusion of our discussion. Caste acts both as disruptive and cohesive factor in Indian politics. It provides a basis for the emergence of several interest groups in their Indian political system, each of which competes with every other groups in their struggle for recognition and power. The caste consciousness has led to the emergence of new trends in Indian politics, whereby the previous caste affiliations with different political parties are getting broken and new caste equations are emerging to replace the old ones. Under the impact of modern politics, associations of caste have become the hallmark of political mobilization. They have emerged with the objective of pursuing political power, social status, and economic interest. Members of certain caste groups who were considered low or lowest in the socio-economic hierarchy a few decades ago are now amalgamated together into a common organization to press for their demands. With a growing confidence and status that not only actively participate in the political process, but also assert their identity and even strive for position. Thank you.